Welcome back to continuing the discussion, and we're in Genesis chapter 20. So welcome back, friends. Today we're continuing the discussion with Genesis 20. At first glance, this might feel a bit like deja vu. Abraham once again finds himself in a foreign land, and once again he tells a king that Sarah is his sister. If you're thinking, wait, didn't we already see this in Genesis 12? You're right. But this version goes even deeper, because now Abraham isn't a brand new believer, just trying to survive. He's already received God's covenant, God's promises, and even the prophecy that Sarah will give birth within a year. So why is he still afraid? That's what makes this chapter so honest and so important. Let's dive in. Abraham moves into Gerar, a Philistine region ruled by King Abimelek. And just like in Egypt, he tells the king that Sarah is his sister. Now, yes, technically, she's his half-sister, but the point isn't the family tree. It's the intent behind the claim. Abraham is trying to protect himself at Sarah's expense by hiding the truth. And here's what's wild. This happens right after God has reaffirmed the promise of Isaac. Abraham knows that Sarah is the vessel of that promise, but he still risks her being taken into another man's house before we get too hard on Abraham. Let's be honest. How many of us have received promises from God only to act out of fear when the pressure hits? Fear can still live alongside faith, but when it leads our decisions, it exposes our weakness. And yet, God shows up, not in fire or judgment, but in a dream. God warns Abimelek in the night, "You are as good as dead because of the woman you have taken." But when God adds something he adds something fascinating. "I kept you from sinning against me. That's why I didn't let you touch her." There it is, divine restraint. God stepped in before things went too far, and that leads us to our first reflection question. What does this chapter teach us about God's protection, not just from enemies, but from ourselves? When we often think of God's protection as shielding us from harm done to us, but here we see God protecting people from doing harm. He protects Abimelek, a pagan king, from sinning. He protects Sarah, who was also caught in the middle, and honestly, he protects Abraham from the consequences of his own compromise. That's grace. God doesn't just clean up after us. He sometimes intervenes to prevent the disaster entirely. This makes me wonder, how many times has God stopped something before I even knew it needed stopping? How many things in our lives have been held together by God's quiet hand, not because we got it right, but because he's merciful? In the morning, Abimelek confronts Abraham, and honestly, he shows more moral clarity than Abraham does. He says, "What have you done to us? How could you do this?" And Abraham gives a weak answer. He says, I thought there was no fear of God in this place, but clearly there was." That's a huge lesson for us. Sometimes the people we assume are far from God act with more integrity than we do. But God can speak to Abimelek. God can speak to Abimelek. God can convict him. God can use him to rebuke Abraham. It reminds us God's sovereignty isn't limited to the covenant family. He's working in the hearts everywhere. So here's our second reflection question. How does God's protection still operate when we fall short? And why do we sometimes assume that the worst about people God is working in? Abraham assumed the worst about Abimelek, that he was godless, dangerous, immoral. But Abimelek ends up being the one who listens to God, protects Sarah, restores her, and blesses Abraham. This turns everything upside down. Sometimes our assumptions about people blind us to the ways God is moving. Here, are there people in your life that you've written off thinking God could never use them? This story reminds us God's grace runs wider than we think, and his mercy isn't limited to the people we expect. The chapter ends with God healing Abimelek's household after Abraham prays for him. That's important. Even though Abraham messed up, God still uses him to intercede. The one who lied is the one who prays, and God responds. That's grace again. God doesn't throw Abraham away. He disciplines, yes, but he still honors the covenant. And Sarah, she's restored. Her body's preserved for the promise, and in the very next chapter, Isaac is born. Nothing derailed God's plan. Not Abraham's fear, not Abimelek's ignorance, not human failure, because when God makes a promise, he keeps it. Reflection recap. What does this chapter teach us about God's protection? Not just from enemies, but from ourselves. And number 2, why do we sometimes assume the worst about people God is already working in? Well, that'll be it for today's continuing the discussion. I hope you continue this discussion. Write any questions down below, or any comments that anybody has, any other reflections they have about this chapter. This was a very interesting chapter for me. We'll be back for chapter 21.